Morning, everybody. All right, state may call its next witness.
Your Honor, the state calls Kerr Yang.
We're going to stand right here. Just raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Proceed, please. And first of all, if you feel comfortable doing so, we'd appreciate if you could remove your mask so you could be heard more clearly.
Yes, sir.
And then begin by stating your full name, spelling each of your names.
My name is Kerr Yang. First name is spelled K-E-R, last name is spelled Y-A-N-G.
Mr. Slisher.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
How are you employed?
I am employed with the City of Minneapolis Police Department.
How long have you been employed by the City of Minneapolis?
I have been with the department for approximately 24 years.
And what's your current position with Minneapolis?
My current position is I am the Crisis Intervention Training Coordinator for the department.
And your current rank?
I hold the rank of sergeant.
First, I'd like you to tell the jury a little bit about yourself. How old are you, sir?
I'll be 50 this year.
Okay. And you indicated you've been employed by MPD for 24 years?
Approximately 24 years, yes.
Could you please share with the jury your educational background?
I received my bachelor in psychology and criminal justice. I received my master's degree in counseling psychology and my doctorate in general psychology.
When did you complete your doctorate?
I completed that back in 2014.
Okay. And when you started, after you started with MPD, did you go through the academy?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Describe that experience. What year did you start?
I started the academy as a cadet in September of September of 1996. I had to take some additional college courses because of the cadet program, and then from the cadet program, I went through the academy as a recruit.
After you completed the coursework at the academy, did you enter the field training program?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And how long were you in that program?
I believe it was approximately 6 months, 5 or 6 months. It's been a long time ago, so.
After you completed your field training, what was your first assignment?
I was assigned to, if my memory served me properly, I believe I was assigned to downtown precinct after I finished my field training.
As a patrol officer?
Yes, as a patrol officer.
And how long did you serve as a patrol officer before being promoted to sergeant?
I was a patrol officer for, I would say, if not including specialty unit 2, I would say a little bit over 10 years.
Would you please describe for the jury some of the precincts to which you were assigned in your assignments before promoting to sergeant?
I was assigned to downtown precinct. I was also assigned to the Police Activity League. I was also assigned to Housing Patrol, School Patrol, and 5th Precinct before I came to actually 5th Precinct. And when I got promoted, I was assigned to 4th Precinct during my supervisor orientation. I went to robbery for my supervisory orientation, and then I was assigned to downtown as a supervisor before I became the Crisis Intervention Training Coordinator for the training unit.
Now, as a patrol officer, have you ever been in a situation where it's been necessary for you to use force?
Yes.
Have you ever arrested a suspect?
Yes.
Have you ever arrested a suspect who was reluctant to be arrested?
Yes.
You've had to handcuff people who were struggling?
Yes.
And now you're the crisis training coordinator. Where are you assigned as the crisis training coordinator?
I am currently assigned to the training unit.
Where's that located?
It's located on the north side at what we call the Special Operations Center. at 4119 DuPont Avenue North.
Can you please describe your role as the crisis training coordinator?
As the crisis training coordinator, I am responsible for collaborating and coordinating with mental health professionals and community members and civilians to come and teach our officers about crisis and crisis de-escalation. And at times, I've also trained our officers too.
What do you mean by crisis?
Crisis could be any event, situation that is beyond a person's coping mechanism. And during that, when it's beyond their control, sometimes they don't know what to do. And we train them to assist a person to bring them back down to their pre-crisis level.
Could you please share with the jury some examples of types of crises?
Crisis could be mental health, mental illness related, or it could be situational. It could be that somebody got into a car crash, for example, and they're just so affected by that they don't know what to do, and that could be a crisis. So that could be an example of a crisis.
Can intoxication be a crisis?
Yes, intoxication could be a crisis too, yes.
Through drugs or alcohol?
Yes,
Certain types of anxiety could be a crisis?
yes.
Does the Minneapolis Police Department have a policy pertaining to persons in crisis?
Yes, it does.
And at a high level, can you explain what that policy requires?
The policy requires that when it's safe and feasible, that we shall de-escalate.
Does the Minneapolis Police Department, I'm assuming as the crisis training coordinator, you're aware of any training or tools that it provides law enforcement officers to abide by this policy?
Yes,
Does that include training officers to recognize when persons may be in crisis?
yes,
Some of the signs of crisis and types of crisis?
yes,
And there is a specific crisis intervention training course that the Minneapolis Police Department sponsors or puts on down at the training center, is that right?
that is correct, yes.
And in your role as coordinator, you bring the instructors in for that.
That is correct.
Have you been through the course itself?
I have been through the course, yes, and I have sat through some of the courses too, yes.
Now, Exhibit 203, which we won't publish at this time, contains some training records. And those training records indicate that crisis intervention training was offered within 2016 and also 2018. And I'd like to talk to you about the larger block, the 2016 block. Now, first I have to ask you, do you recognize the name Derek Chauvin?
Yes.
How do you recognize it?
I recognize the name Derek Chauvin through training.
Okay. You're familiar with this person?
No.
Would you recognize him if you saw him?
Yes.
All right. Do you see him in the courtroom today?
He has a mask on. I'm assuming that's him.
All right. May the record reflect that the witness has identified the defendant.
Record also reflect.
Exhibit 203, the training records indicate that in 2016, the defendant participated in a lengthier course, approximately a 40-hour course in crisis intervention training. Are you familiar with that type of course, the 40-hour crisis intervention training course?
Yes.
And is that a course that you've personally participated in as a student?
That course was delivered to the department, to the officers by Minnesota CIT Officers Associations.
And can you, just in general terms, explain what that course covers?
That course covers individual in crisis, symptoms, and de-escalation strategies that may be used for individual in crisis. So it's a scenario-based training.
What do you mean by that?
The trainer, Minnesota CIT Officers Association, brings in professional actors to come in and to conduct crisis scenarios where they're in a state of crisis, and then our officer has to use de-escalating strategies to bring them down to pre-crisis level or to help them out.
And so the officers are given an opportunity to practice recognizing what may be signs of persons in crisis and respond appropriately?
Yes.
I'd like to talk to you about a related concept. You familiar with the critical decision-making model?
Yes, I do.
How are you familiar with that model?
I attended, the critical decision-making model was introduced to us by the police executive research forums. I, along with some of my colleagues, we attended a training session that was conducted by a representative from PERF, or the Police Executive Research Forums, and we adapted that model to MPD's use to guide our officers in their decision-making process.
And does the critical decision-making model, is there an application to crisis intervention?
Yes, it does.
Also an application to use of force?
Yes.
And sometimes those decisions will have to be made contemporaneously, is that right?
Yes.
At this time, I'd like to publish Exhibit 276, the critical decision-making model. You recognize this document?
Yes, sir.
And this is the critical decision-making model with which you're familiar?
Yes, sir.
Could you please explain, based on your familiarity with this, this graphic, the middle circle?
The middle circle, what you see in the middle circle are voice, neutrality, respect, and trust. Those are the pillars of procedural justice that was introduced to the department.
What is procedural justice?
Procedural justice basically is the legitimacy in our action. What we do are our actions legitimate, and that is what procedural justice is about, is legitimacy.
And the training center also offers courses in procedural justice as well, is that right?
That is correct, yes.
This critical decision-making model is adapted in part from those materials, the procedural justice materials.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. Now, going back to the outer part of the circle, the first step of information gathering, and you see that it goes kind of a wheel that's supposed to represent critical decision-making or thinking, is that right?
That's correct.
Would you please, we've heard a little bit about this critical thinking decision-making model already, but I'd like you to discuss how this works in the context of crisis intervention, starting with the first block.
Is information gathering. We believe that this model has application not only for crisis, but especially for crisis. That is why it is part of our crisis curriculum. And the first circle, what you see there is information gathering. And information gathering is really crucial to what tactics or what decisions we're going to make. And information gathering could be based on dispatch, or it could be based on the own officer's observation.
Observations of what?
Observation of the scene, observation of the person, could be observation of the environment that is going on. So.
And some of these observations, for example, could just be physical observations, right? The officer could look at the person and make some sort of an assessment as to whether or not there's a behavioral crisis.
Yes.
Listening, is that also important?
Listening is important, yes.
Any other information that an officer would generally assess or take in when considering whether a person is in crisis?
Even listening, listening is key. Other observation, even touch, for example. If you officer hands is on the person, you can sometimes sense tensing up, and you can tell that maybe the person's in crisis or not. So.
Then going to the next step, taking that information and potentially assessing it. What's the threat risk assessment block?
Risk is the possibility that something bad or dangerous may happen, and threat, in a sense, is the danger, and whether that danger is going to cause harm or not.
Now, with risk, you say it's the potential, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that the person is being threatened or themselves is threatened. Is that right?
That is correct, yes, sir.
It's just the mere possibility. And many people could present some sort of a risk. Everybody presents some sort of a risk, right?
Yes.
And it's up to the officer in the information gathering to determine whether that risk is small, large, or elevates to a threat.
Sustained.
And how does the, I apologize, Your Honor, how does the officer then assess whether or not a risk is small, large, or could develop into a threat?
That is up to the officers and the totality of circumstances and information they have at that time.
The next step then, after the threat or risk assessment, authority to act, could you please describe how that step is taken in the context of crisis intervention?
The authority to act is based on our policy, also based on state statutes and case law too, for individual in crisis. And those are some of the authority that we have in handling people in crisis.
Some of those policies and the authority could include the use of force policy,
Yes.
the de-escalation policy,
Yes.
and the crisis intervention policy.
Yes, sir.
The next step then, goals and actions. Please describe the thinking model in terms of crisis intervention regarding goals and actions.
Goals in action is also contingency on based on the information. Really, the ultimate goal in action of somebody in a crisis is to see if that person needs help and what kind of help. Does that person need to go to the hospital, or does the person can be turned over to somebody that has the authority to watch over that person? So it's really to go for somebody in crisis is determined to see if that person needs help.
And then the next block in terms of crisis intervention, review and reassess. Could you please describe how that works in this scenario?
Review and reassess is as information becomes available. We continuously review and reassess the situation to see if our technique on de-escalation or other technique is working. If it's not working, then we adjust our technique, strategies.
Could you also then go backwards and adjust your goals and actions?
Yes, you can.
So, for example, if initially the goal is to arrest someone, after taking in information, if you determine the person needed medical attention, could you act on that?
Yes.
And then what would the action be if the person was in need of medical attention?
That would be the immediate goal for us. If somebody's in need of medical attention, then we give them medical attention.
Okay. And then that would also relate to backwards to the authority to act, is that right?
Yes.
Looking at the policy, and there's a duty to provide medical attention in the policy, right?
Yes.
Now, how is this critical decision-making model imparted to Minneapolis police officers in the training program?
We believe in the application of these critical decision-making models. So I introduced this model with approval, of course, to the department in 2018.
And, you've been in the situation where you've had to use force before. You were in the field for a long time. Do you have an assessment as to whether or not this model is useful in the field?
I believe it's useful. That is why we introduced this model and introduced it to the officers.
And is it practical?
It is practical. Yeah, I believe it is practical.
And can you explain how so? I mean, some of these situations involving police officers occur fairly quickly, is that right?
That is true.
Is it possible for a police officer to use this critical thinking model in the field when when events are unfolding quickly?
It is possible. To rehearse and reusing this model, it will almost be like, it could be almost like memory. And when we talk about fast evolving situations, I know that they do exist, they do happen, but a lot of the time, converse of that is that a lot of the time, we have the time to slow things down and reevaluate, reassess, and go through this model.
Do you provide this training because you believe it works?
I will provide this training because I believe it works, yes.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Mr. Nelson.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, sir.
Thank you for being here with us today. I have a few follow-up questions. So your role with the Minneapolis Police Department is currently training officers involved in the crisis intervention techniques,
That's correct, sir, yes.
as well as the critical decision-making model, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And you assisted the Minneapolis Police Department in developing its policies and procedures surrounding both the crisis intervention technique as well as critical decision-making policies, right?
Yes, sir.
Right. You said you introduced these policies with the approval from the chief or the higher-ups, right?
It has to be approved before we can deliver this training, yes.
Right. And these trainings then ultimately helped form some policies of the Minneapolis Police Department.
Yes, but not the critical decision-making model. It's not in the policy.
Right. But the crisis intervention technique is in the policy.
Crisis intervention is in the policy, yes.
Okay. So, and you have a long career as a police officer, both in the field and also in the training and investigation units. And so you have your own personal experiences in dealing with people out on the street, right?
That's correct, yes, sir.
Now, are there situations in your own experience where you've had to use force on someone and other people observing the use of force don't like what you're doing?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And in fact, I believe you would describe sometimes that the public doesn't understand that police actions can look really bad.
That's correct, sir, yes.
Right. But they still may be lawful even if they look bad, right?
Yes, sir.
And part of the whole goal of the crisis intervention technique or policies is to not only deal with the suspect, but also other people who may be watching, correct?
That's correct, yes, sir.
And so in situations where citizens or bystanders start to congregate and watch what police are doing, you would agree that that could potentially become a crisis for those observers.
Potentially, yes.
And you train officers in how to deal with those situations, right?
That's correct, yes, sir.
When we look at the critical decision-making model, not policy, but when we look at the critical decision-making model, that is what you would describe as a rapid, very dynamic model, right?
Yes, sir.
It's not just focusing on one particular thing, it's assessing many, many things that are happening in the context of an arrest, right?
Yes, sir.
And some of those things could be the interactions that you're having with citizen observers, right?
Yes.
And the training that you provide, there are materials that the department maintains, correct?
That's correct.
So I'm going to ask the court to just display to the witness. I can switch this here. What has been marked as Exhibit 122. Do you recognize this to be training materials prepared by the Minneapolis Police Department Crisis Intervention Team?
Yes, sir.
All right. And so I'm going to just go. So I'm going to have you just look at this. This is the material and the training materials that the crisis intervention team present to the officers in this 40-hour training, right?
No, sir.
This is the training that you received?
This is the training that I created.
That
It
you-
wasn't delivered to Chauvin or the other officer.
Okay, so this is something that you created to train Minneapolis police officers?
Yes.
All right. But this is a more recent model than the 2018 model?
This is a program that we created really to target the recruit in the cadet academies.
Okay,
Yeah. So this is separate from what Chauvin and the other officers went through.
okay. But some of the information is generally applicable to all police officers who are trained in crisis intervention as well as de-escalation, right?
Yes, sir.
And officers are trained to look for potential signs of aggression from suspects or crowd observers, right?
Yes, sir.
And what are some of the potential signs of aggression that officers are trained to watch for?
Based on this document that you sent here, it could be standing tall, red in the face, raised voice, rapid breathing, muscle tensing, agitations, pacing, prolonged eye contact, exaggerated gesture.
So an officer who's making an arrest of a suspect and there's bystanders watching and growing in their intensity, these are the types of behaviors that officers are specifically trained to watch for from either the suspect or observers, right?
Yes.
Rephrase.
Thank you. Mr. Yang, as a part of, or excuse me, Sergeant Yang, as a part of your role in the Minneapolis Police Department, do you train both cadets, recruits, as well as veteran officers?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And can you describe the difference between the training that a cadet would receive versus a veteran officer?
Something like this will be given to the recruits and officers that have gone through the Minnesota CIT Officers Association's training on crisis de-escalation. We will give them a progression training. We will introduce other topics like autism to them and go through different type of topic that is part of crisis training. So it's a little bit different. It's different from what the recruits and the regular officer will get.
Now, the information that is presented to recruits versus veteran officers, is it generally the same type, broad categories of information?
It's possible the same, yeah, similar. We want to be consistent, so it's similar, yes.
Right. And so the information that a veteran officer would receive in a 40-hour training would be inclusive of what to look for in terms of crisis, would it not?
Yes.
Right. You would train officers on the policy about crisis intervention, correct?
Yes.
You would train them about what to look for when a person is in crisis, right?
Yes. Are you talking about recruit training or the veteran officer?
Veteran officer.
The veteran officers, are you referring to the 40-hour training? Or
Yes.
40 hours training, I have nothing to do with the 40-hour training for the veteran officer. That's Minnesota CIT Officers Associations.
Okay. So you don't know any information that the veteran training officer, the veteran officers would receive?
I do know some of it, but not the entire curriculum.
Okay. You've trained veteran officers yourself?
I do, but not in the 40-hour week.
Understood. But in the refresher type
In
courses?
refresher type course, yes.
Right. And in the refresher type courses, do you discuss with officers the policy of crisis intervention?
Yes.
Do you discuss with officers the signs to look for, both in terms of suspects as well as individuals observing?
Especially the suspects.
Especially the suspects.
Yes.
But ultimately, you would agree that that training also includes the critical decision-making model, right?
Yes.
And the critical decision-making model is not limited to or focused on simply the suspect, correct?
He's back onto a topic where he can lead now.
Correct?
I'm sorry?
I was just answering the objection. It's overruled, so you can answer.
Okay, will you repeat that, sir?
Sure. I have to remember my question. The critical decision-making policy that you train veteran officers on would be inclusive of people other than just the suspect. Is that correct?
There is no policy on the critical decision-making model, only on the crisis policy.
Okay. The critical decision-making model, I keep calling it a policy, that's just my fault, but the critical decision-making model is not limited to interpreting or responding to the suspect exclusively. is it?
That's correct.
An officer is trained in the critical decision-making model to go out and review the entirety of the situation, the totality of the circumstances, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And the totality of the circumstances is more than just how you interact with the subject with whom you are arresting, right?
That's correct.
That would include citizen bystanders, right?
That's correct.
What to do when a citizen bystander starts filming you.
That's correct, yes, sir.
How to try to interpret whether citizens pose a threat or a risk, right?
Right.
How to you would consider your own interactions also with the suspect themselves, correct?
That's correct.
And you describe this critical decision-making model as being a very dynamic, ever-changing thing based upon information that comes to the officer in real time, right?
That's correct, yes, sir.
And so an officer may consider, who has used force, may move backwards in the policy, but may have to jump somewhere else in the policy because new information comes, or the model.
Yes, sir.
And so it is a constantly evolving process where an officer is entrusted to make decisions based on all of the information that he or she perceives, correct?
That's correct, sir. Yes, sir.
Right. And that also would include training, right? Their training.
Yes, sir.
And other things that may not be apparent to a citizen.
Yes, sir.
Right. Tactical decision-making, for example.
Yes, sir.
Knowing that medical help was on the way, right?
Yes, sir.
Making decisions about officer safety, right?
Yes, sir.
So all of these, it's not just one small thing that you're focused only on the subject that you're arresting. You're taking in a lot of information and processing it all kind of simultaneously through this critical decision-making model. Agreed?
That's great. Yes, sir.
All right. And so in terms of, and I'll take this down for now, but in terms of the information that you advise or talk to officers, veteran officers about, are how to recognize the signs of someone in crisis, right?
Yes, sir.
And the Minneapolis Police Department policy on crisis intervention has a pretty specific definition of what constitutes a crisis, right?
Yes, sir.
It's not limited to someone who may have a mental health problem, right?
Yes, sir.
It could include people who are using controlled substances.
Yes, sir.
It could include people who are simply experiencing some event that is overwhelming them, right?
Yes, sir.
And that may be losing a job or getting a divorce, but it could be what that person is observing at the time. Agreed?
Yes, sir.
And so the crisis intervention policy actually defines crisis as having a trajectory, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that trajectory can increase in its severity over time.
Yes, sir.
And that's why it becomes important for an officer to create time and distance, right?
Yes, sir.
And creating time and distance for an officer is an important part of the de-escalation process, is it not?
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that you train police officers that as that intensity of crisis increases, the risk or threat to the officer grows greater?
I don't believe I train a specific like that because as the intensity, my training is that as the intensity increases and you have the distance and you, like you said, the time, you try to bring it down, not increase the intensity of it.
What I'm talking about is not the officer trying to increase the intensity of it. My question is this: as a person is in crisis and the intensity of their own personal crisis grows, you train officers that as they kind of get more intense, the risk to the officer or others is greater.
Yes, sir.
And in fact, officers are trained to respond to that in a variety of ways, right?
Yes, sir.
And some of the techniques that the Minneapolis Police Department trains both veterans and recruits would be to have a confidence about them, right?
Confidence about them?
Right.
Yes, sir.
An officer should try to appear confident in his or her actions.
Yes, sir.
They should also try to stay calm, right?
Yes, sir.
They should try to maintain space, right?
Yes.
They should speak slowly and softly.
Yes, sir.
They should avoid staring or eye contact.
Yes, sir.
And ultimately, when a police officer is dealing with any situation, they could be dealing with any number of people who are in crisis, right?
Yes, sir.
Right? The subject, the arrestee, may be in crisis, right?
Yes, sir.
People who are watching may be in crisis.
Yes, sir.
Another officer could be in crisis,
Yes, sir.
right? And an officer has to take all of that in and do this assessment and make a determination as to what his or her next steps would be, right?
Yes, sir.
And the observations of the officer in that situation, I think you described on direct examination, you described that an officer will also take into and apply to the critical decision-making model his or her own sensory perception.
Yes, sir.
So the touch of feeling a suspect be tense, right?
Yes, sir.
Or loose, right?
Yes, sir.
What they may hear comes into play.
Yes, sir.
So if they hear people threatening them or potentially threatening violence, that goes into that critical decision-making model as well, right?
Yes, sir.
And oftentimes, the scene of an arrested individual is very tense, right?
Yes, sir.
I have no further questions.
Any redirect?
If we could publish Exhibit 276 again, please. Thank you. So I'm displaying again the critical decision-making model that you've been testifying about. And the thrust of your direct testimony was using this in terms of assessing a person in crisis for the purpose of determining whether or not they needed medical intervention. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Now, in discussing this, and I guess relating it to some of the broader force concepts that defense counsel was questioning about, again, all of these things must be taken into account when deciding the next step. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And the officer always has to keep in mind their authority to act. That's one of the parts of the model. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Now, defense counsel asked you if the officer should just focus on one small thing. And I would like you to make some sort of comment on differentiating between a small thing and a big thing. Because you would agree that something that is a big thing would probably be more important than a small thing, right?
It depends on what the big thing is and what the small thing is.
Well, for example, if we're looking at assessing somebody's medical condition, right, for the purpose of rendering emergency aid, would that be a big thing or a small thing?
That would be a big thing.
If then that is contrasted with, say, a 17-year-old filming you with a camera, would that be a big thing, the filming, or a small thing?
The filming will be a small thing.
And so then if you're taking all of the situations, all the circumstances into account, you have a big thing and you have a small thing, you're again looking at your authority to act, and that's policy, right?
Yes, sir.
And policy would include the policy governing the use of force and that it must be reasonable, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it would also include, for authority to act, the duty to render medical aid. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
As the policy is written, correct?
Yes, sir.
Which includes not only contacting the ambulance, but performing emergency aid like chest compressions or CPR.
Yes, sir.
Nothing further.
Anything further? Briefly, please.
Sergeant Yang, in terms of the critical decision-making model, again, you're analyzing all of these things, medical aid, threats from citizens or observers, whether people are recording, what you're seeing, what you're feeling. It all is premised on whether it is safe and feasible to do something, correct?
Yes, sir.
Nothing further.
Anything else?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, Sergeant. You are excused.
Thank you, Your Honor.
And is that your water, sir, or is it? Oh, okay, thanks. All right, next witness, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, the state calls Johnny Mercil.
Raise your right hand. You swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes, Your Honor.
Have a seat, please.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You anticipate what I was going to ask you to do. If we could have you state your full name, spell each of your names.
Johnny Mercil, Johnnny. Mercil is Mercil.
Mr. Slisher.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, how are you employed?
With the City of Minneapolis Police Department.
Right, and what do you do for the city of Minneapolis?
I'm currently on medical leave, but I'm a lieutenant with the Minneapolis Police Department.
How long have you been with MPD?
Since 1996.
I'd like you to tell the jury a little bit about yourself first. Could you share your educational background?
Yes, sir. I got a 4-year degree from the University of North Dakota in criminal justice studies.
What year?
I graduated in 95.
And after you graduated from the university, did you get a job in law enforcement right away, or did you go elsewhere?
No, sir. I got hired from the Minneapolis Police Department in 1996 and joined the Minneapolis Police Academy.
Describe your academy experience.
I was a cadet, so we did a combination of the police academy along with college courses to qualify for the Minnesota post test.
Did you take and pass the post test? Your
Yes, sir.
Licensed peace officer?
Let's hold on a little bit so we don't talk over each other.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, thank you.
Yes, sir.
All right. After you completed your coursework with the academy, did you go into a field training program?
Yes, sir.
How long were you in that program?
I believe it was about 4 months at that time.
Okay. And then you received your first assignment as a police officer, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Can you please tell the jury what your first assignment was? Where were you and what were your duties?
Yes, I was a patrol officer assigned to the 3rd Precinct, which is southeast Minneapolis. And duties were patrolling the streets, answering 911 calls.
Okay. How long did you serve as a patrol officer in the 3rd Precinct?
Initially for a couple of years, and then I went to the community response team, which is a plainclothes unit.
What is, it's also referred, the community response team, I've heard it called the CRT.
Yes, sir.
Well,
CERT team.
CERT team. What does that do?
They respond to the local community's concerns about crime, prostitution, drug dealing, gang activity.
How long were you with the CERT team?
I did that for about 3 years.
And then what was your assignment afterwards?
From there, I went to the Mounted Patrol Unit, and that was technically downtown unit at the time.
What does the
Second.
Mounted Patrol Unit do?
We patrol on horseback, mainly crowd control. For busy times in Minneapolis, we focused on bar close in downtown Minneapolis.
Yeah, how long did you do that?
Full-time for about 1.5 years, and then I went to patrol in downtown Middle Watch, the precinct.
Okay. How long were you in the downtown Middle Watch assignment?
I was on downtown Middle Watch until 2006, and then I got promoted to sergeant.
In order to be promoted for sergeant, did you take an exam and pass it?
Yes, sir. It's a civil service exam along with an assessment center.
And after you were selected as sergeant, you received your first assignment?
Yes, sir.
What was that?
I went to the robbery unit in downtown here at City Hall. And then from there, I went to the juvenile unit. And then I eventually ended up back downtown on patrol as a supervisor.
Okay. And how long did that take? What year are we up to now?
Oh, I think we're at about 2007, 2008.
Okay. And after that?
I was there for a couple of years. I ended up going back to Mounted Patrol full-time as a sergeant in charge of the unit. That went through 2009. I went back to the street for about 1.5 years, and then I went to the Minneapolis Police Department's gang enforcement team as a sergeant.
Okay.
And then we, from there, I investigated gang crimes, gun crimes. And then after that assignment, I ended up on the north side on patrol for about 1 year, 1.5 years, and then I went back downtown as a sergeant on the community response team, the CERT team downtown. And then in 2017, I took the exam for lieutenant and passed and was a lieutenant in 2017.
And where were you assigned then as a lieutenant?
After I got promoted, I was transferred to the training division in charge of use of force.
I'd like you to talk to the jury a little bit about your own background in the use of force. You're familiar with the Minneapolis Police Departmental policy regarding the use of force?
Yes, sir. I trained for several years for that.
That was a part of your academy training?
Partially. You get to be familiar with the use of force through the academy.
And then after you left the academy, did you have to take refresher courses, which would have included use of force training every year
Yes, sir.
in order to maintain your post license?
That's correct, sir.
Have you had training beyond that, beyond what was presented at the academy and your yearly certification?
Yes, sir.
Could you please describe it?
Yes, I became a part-time use of force instructor in about 2010, and I maintained that part-time status as a use of force instructor up until I was promoted to lieutenant, where I went to the training unit full-time.
What did you have to do to become qualified to be a use of force instructor?
Went through different courses designed to train us up on use of force. I also started training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for the department as part of our ground defense initiative. Several other classes in different academies I went through too.
And I'd like to maybe qualify a few terms, if we may. We've talked about use of force and use of force training. We also hear the term defensive tactics. Can you differentiate between the two?
I think they're interchangeable. I think use of force is probably the more appropriate term, but I think defensive tactics has been more of a term that's been used longer, so people tend to refer to use of force instructors as defensive tactic instructors.
Would a defensive tactics, in terms of defensive tactics instruction, include more hands-on type instruction? You'd mentioned Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for example.
Yes, sir.
Right. Were you interested in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu before becoming a police officer, or how did that develop?
No, sir. I was in martial arts through college, and then I got interested in it from some of the other use of force instructors, kind of recruited me to do that, and really fell in love with the art form and really what its implications and uses are for law enforcement specifically.
Would you please just provide a very high-level overview of what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is and some of its basic principles?
Yes, sir. It's a form of martial art that really focuses on leverage and body control, de-emphasizes strikes. In a true Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there aren't strikes. There's no punching or kicking. It's using your body weight, kind of like wrestling, and joint lock, manipulation, neck restraints, things that, pain compliance as well as physical body control to get people to comply.
So you use that phrase, pain compliance. What is that?
Pain compliance is using a technique that causes the person you're using it against to have pain so they comply to your, whatever it is you're asking them to do.
So if we were to use an example, maybe from childhood, you're familiar with the game Mercy,
Yes, sir.
right? Where you lock fingers and twist down and then somebody has to submit. Is it similar to that?
Yes, sir.
All right. Although Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is not the only defensive tactic that officers at MPD are trained on, is it?
No, sir.
It's just one of a variety of different tools that can be employed to deploy force. Is that right?
That's correct.
For the purpose of enforcing the law, correct?
That's correct.
Then, as a use of force instructor, after you became certified, did you have to become knowledgeable in all the relevant departmental policies and procedures regarding the use of force, the 5-300 series,
Yes, sir.
as well as state law governing the use of force, which is largely integrated into Minneapolis departmental policy? Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you indicated that you were a lieutenant over in the training center, is that right?
Training division, sir.
Training division. And please describe your role then as a lieutenant in the training division.
Yes, sir. I was in charge of use of force. I was also in charge of our patrol operations section of training, as well as the police range. And I was in charge of all of our continuing education to make sure that our officers are fulfilling their post mandates to maintain their license to be a police officer.
And as part of that, to make sure that you're properly reporting to the post board, you keep records, sign-in sheets and whatnot of particular officers having completed training, is that right?
That's correct.
And those training hours are collected and reported into the workforce director program?
Yes, sir.
Right, so you have an accurate record of who's been trained in what, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And is it, when you're the lieutenant of the training division with use of force, are you coordinating both pre-service and in-service training?
Yes, sir. The pre-service side would be use of force, the range, and patrol operations. The in-service side is what we consider to be the post mandates that we have to keep up with. That's the post-service side, in service.
And as the lieutenant, obviously, you're in charge of, you're in a position of rank over the sergeants, is that right?
That's correct.
And those are usually the level, the trainers would largely be at the sergeant level, is that right?
Mainly officers with some sergeants overseeing.
As the lieutenant and the person in charge of this training, are you familiar with the curriculum that is imparted upon both pre-service and in-service trainees?
Yes, sir.
You help develop the curriculum,
Yes, sir.
and you approve the curriculum.
Yes, sir.
The curriculum could include, does include just a general booklet that's put together by the defensive tactics instructors, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And that booklet contains the general concepts for use of force that are imparted on pre-service trainees and in-service trainees, is that right?
That's correct.
If I could show Exhibit 126 just to the witness. All right, I'm showing you what's been marked for identification as Exhibit 126. It's labeled Minneapolis Police Department Use of Force Manual Academics and Techniques, produced by the MPD Defensive Tactics Team. Are you familiar with this document and its predecessor documents?
Yes, sir.
Does this document contain sort of the general curriculum and knowledge that's imparted upon MPD pre-service and in-service trainees?
Yes, sir.
Offer Exhibit 126.
126 is received.
And we won't publish that at this point. And do you also participate in and approve various classroom PowerPoint training sessions that are imparted upon both pre-service and in-service trainees?
Yes, sir.
And at this time, just to the witness, I would like to show what's been marked for identification as Exhibit 119. Exhibit 119 is a slide deck that's labeled 2018 Defensive Tactics in Service. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
If you could show the witness the second page. And do you see your name on the slide deck listed at the top of the instructors?
Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the contents of this particular PowerPoint presentation or slide deck?
Yes, sir.
Did you help create it?
Yes, sir.
And you approved its use during the training, is that right?
That's correct.
And it's listed as fall of 2018, so this is what would have been provided for in-service training, so experienced performing officers during this 2018 session, correct?
That's correct.
And is the training that's provided, you know, you have quite a few Minneapolis police officers who have to go through the training, right?
Yes, sir.
So they're not all taking it at the same time.
That's correct.
But if someone has completed the fall 2018 in-service defensive tactics training, does that mean that they saw this slide deck?
Yes, sir.
I'll offer Exhibit 119.
119 is received.
And we talked about training records as well and sign-in sheets, and so I'd like to show the witness Exhibit 124. Exhibit 124 is labeled 2018 Annual In-Service Training Program, Group B. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And I see your name at the top as one of the instructors, is that right?
That's correct.
This is a sign-in sheet that would show different officers who would sign in having taken the training.
That's correct.
Turn to page 2. Do you see the name Derek Chauvin on this training roster?
Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with that name, Derek Chauvin?
Yes, sir.
Chauvin, I'm sorry, Derek Chauvin. Do you, would you recognize Mr. Chauvin if you saw him in the courtroom today?
Yes, sir.
Do you see him today?
I do, sir.
Would you please point to him and describe what he's wearing?
Yes, sir. He's got a dark blue tie, light blue shirt, and a gray jacket.
May the record reflect the witness has identified the defendant.
It will.
Go back to page 1. And at this time, I will offer Exhibit 124.
24. 124 is received.
Permission to publish 124. Right. If you could highlight the instructor block and title. All right, again, you see that this is the 2018, this training was provided on October 1, 2018, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you are listed as one of the trainers, correct?
That's correct.
And if you could go to page 2 and highlight, please. And there you can see that the training was attended by the defendant, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
You can take that down. How many times do you think you've provided training like what we saw in the exhibit to various officers over the years?
Hundreds of times, sir.
And is this a slide deck that you identified as being the 2018 version fairly consistent with prior versions of the use of force training you've provided?
The documentation, sir?
Yes.
Yes.
So when you do use of force training, there are generally two components, right? There's a classroom component, and then there would be, you know, more of the tactical component. practical exercises, is that right?
That's correct.
And what we saw in the exhibit was the classroom component.
I believe so.
Okay. Well, what I'd like to do now is publish Exhibit 119. And just like you've done hundreds of times before, I'm going to have you explain some of the selected slides to the jury, all right?
Yes, sir.
All right. Please turn to page 2, 119. And again, you can see your name listed on this in-service training as one of the instructors, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And turn to page 4. Page 4 of this slide deck contains a policy reference, is that right?
Yes, sir, it does.
And you testified that you're familiar with the policies, the use of force policies. One of the objectives of training is to impart the policies, teach those policies to the attending officers.
Yes, sir.
And so this is from the the Minneapolis Policy Manual 5-301. Could you please describe to the jury what this slide is intended to convey?
Yes, sir. Looks like there's 3 bullet points. The first one is sanctity of life and the protection of the public. That is the cornerstone of our use of force policies is the sanctity of life and the protection of the public. Also, clear and consistent force policies. We like our policies to be easily understood. And then the use of force standards do fall under the Fourth Amendment reasonableness standard.
And since we're talking about use of force, I'd like to turn to page 7 of the exhibit, 119. When we talk about use of force, explain to the jury what is force.
It's listed on this slide here. Intentional police contact involving any weapon, substance, vehicle, equipment, tool, device, or animal that inflicts pain or injury to another, physical strikes to the body, physical contact to the body that inflicts pain or injury, or restraint applied to manner or circumstance likely to produce injury.
So you train officers that restraint is a form of force, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And when applying force or applying restraint, the restraint has to be reasonable, correct?
Correct.
And it has to be reasonable at the time it starts and the time it stops?
Correct.
You're familiar with the concept of proportionality.
Yes, sir.
If you could turn to the exhibit page 8. When you discuss proportionality to trainees, you use this exhibit, is that right?
Yes, sir.
In general, just without using the slide for a moment, just explain to the jury as you would a group of trainees, what is proportional force?
Well, you want to use the least amount of force necessary to meet your objectives, to control. And if those lower uses of force do not work, would not work, or too unsafe to try, then you can increase your level of force against that person.
You say do not work, would not work, or unsafe to try. It sounds like you maybe have used that phrase a time or two.
Yes, sir.
Is that a phrase that you've used in pretty much every training that you've given on use of force?
When there's a PowerPoint or we talk about use of force, we discuss proportionality regularly.
Okay. And you said that you want to use the least amount of force as necessary?
Yeah, yes, sir.
Why is that?
Because if you can use a lower level of force to meet your objectives, it's safer and better for everybody involved.
And when we talk about proportionality, is proportional to what?
I would say the level of resistance you're getting.
And the level of resistance would be dependent upon who?
The subject that you're using force upon.
The specific subject.
Yes, sir.
All right. At this time, I'm asked to publish Exhibit 110. And this is an item that's already been received into evidence. Do you recognize what's in Exhibit 110?
Yes, sir.
What is that?
Well, it's technically called the Defense and Control Response Training Guide, but a lot of people refer to this as a use of force continuum.
And when we were discussing the concept of proportionality, you talked about subject behavior, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Subject behavior is over here on the left-hand side, correct?
That's correct.
And the subject behavior can vary from, I guess, nothing, to passive resistance, all the way to active aggression, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then in terms of proportionality, there's various tools that are available to a law enforcement officer based on the subject behavior, correct?
That's correct.
And some of these tools, if we can just take an example with active aggression, one response could be what?
Up to and including deadly force.
But then for lower levels of subject activity, such as passive resistance, right, that could include things like presence and verbalization. Right?
That's correct.
And is this something that you use with law enforcement officers you train to sort of graphically represent the concept of proportionality?
I'm not sure if we've used this specific to proportionality of force, but we have used this in the past to describe, like, as levels of resistance increase, that officers' response and also increases.
And similarly, as levels of resistance decrease, what should the officer do?
You should de-escalate use of force as well.
And that's actually listed on this response and control guide, isn't it?
Correct.
If you would clear that, Your Honor. And you'd indicated that you train officers that they should use the least amount of force that is available or that's reasonable under the circumstances. Is that right?
To meet the objectives, yes.
And explain that.
So you want to use the least amount of force if you're trying to control somebody, might be a lower level of force than if you're trying to get them in handcuffs and they're fighting. So you want to use the lowest level of force possible in order to meet those objectives.
And lower levels of force, fair to say, when you're using force, people can get hurt.
Yes, sir.
The subject can get hurt, the officer can get hurt.
Yes, sir.
Is that one of the reasons why it's better to use a lesser amount of force?
Yes, sir.
And another reason is that it's required. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
If you could go back to Exhibit 119 and publish page 12. And you train this to officers. This is back to your training materials. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
The Minnesota statutes provide, and this is integrated into the MPD policy, the concept of minimum restraint. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I'd ask you if you could please highlight the first section. I'm sorry, the second section. All right. What does the policy and the statute provide regarding the amount of restraint that can be used on an arrested subject?
The first line talks about the officer making the arrest may not subject the person arrested to any more restraint than is necessary for the arrest and detention.
What does that mean?
Means the minimum amount of force that you need to accomplish the objective of arresting and detaining somebody is what you should use.
Now, you're familiar with the circumstances that bring you here today, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And I need to show you a photo that's been received into evidence, and it's Exhibit 17, if you'd like to publish that. All right. You see Exhibit 17, and you see the defendant on top of a subject that you know to be George Floyd, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Is this a use of force?
Yes, sir.
If you could take that down, please. I want you to discuss, in terms of using force and using it safely, what you teach your trainees about sort of the frailty of the human body. It's important to be careful with people, is that right?
Oh, yes. It's very, very important to be careful.
And There's some parts of the body that are more prone to injury than others, correct?
That's correct.
And you train on that, is that right?
Yes, sir.
If we could display Exhibit 119, page 49. Now, this is from strike training, is that right?
That's correct.
But is it generally helpful in describing what some of the more sensitive parts of the human body are as you train Minneapolis police officers?
Related to strikes, yes.
Could it be related to other types of restraint as well?
I think you could stretch that some. I don't know exactly how to, what's the question exactly again? I'm sorry.
Is it fair to say that the areas that are marked in red, the red zones, are more prone to injury than other parts of the body? That could be serious.
Yes.
So, for example, the neck
Yes.
and the head
Correct.
and the sternum of the chest. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And this wouldn't just pertain to strikes, it could also pertain to pressure, couldn't it?
Yes.
Is that something you probably knew before you even did any use of force training?
Yes, sir.
Well, I'd like you to then discuss with the jury the concept of neck restraints. And if we could publish it, page 52 of the exhibit. And looking at the time period that you were doing this training, neck restraints were authorized by MPD policy, correct?
Yes, sir.
Can you please describe the training that you provided to Minneapolis police officer regarding the use of neck restraints?
Yes, sir. We'd go over the techniques, definitions of neck restraints, and we'd go through different reps of the neck restraint to get the officers comfortable in doing it.
Could you just give the jury an overview of what a neck restraint is?
Yes, sir. So neck restraint is constricting the sides of a person's neck, and they refer to it as a vascular neck restraint. So you're slowing the blood flow to and from the brain with the intent to gain control of a subject.
And there are two different types of neck restraints in the MPD policy, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And those are what?
The two levels are conscious neck restraint. So that means you've wrapped somebody up and they're still conscious. And you can gain compliance with many people with that. And then there's unconscious, and that's applying pressure until the person, when they're not complying, you put enough pressure that they become unconscious and then therefore comply.
How does one actually apply a neck restraint?
We teach a couple of different techniques, but the basic idea is you use your elbow as a landmark and you place your arm across. So your bicep would be on one side of the neck and your arm would be on the forearm on the other side of the neck. And then there's a couple of different hand placements, but then you apply pressure with head pressure on both sides of the neck to gain compliance.
And you were demonstrating, you were using your arm to do that?
That's correct.
And it'll also be done with a leg?
It can be done with the leg.
Does MPD train on how to do it with a leg?
We may show the younger officers in the academy what that looks like, but we don't train leg neck restraints with the officers in service. And as far as my knowledge, we never have.
How would a trained neck restraint work? I'm sorry, how would a trained leg neck restraint work?
People that watch MMA, so professional fighters, they call it a triangle choke, and I use that term choke loosely. That's just what it's called. But that's when you place your leg over somebody's back, across their side of their neck, and then you trap their arm in, so the person ends up having one arm in, and their arm causes pressure on one side, and the leg causes pressure on the second, and you can actually render somebody unconscious if you hold that long enough.
What part of the leg?
Usually it's the inner thigh.
Inner thigh. So in this scenario, using a leg to do a neck restraint, would the knee sort of replace the elbow in terms of placement? Or how would you describe it?
I would say the knee doesn't really replace the elbow. Your thigh would be across the side of somebody's neck, your leg across their back, and you protect the airway really with the space that's created with their arm being pinned in there.
If you could please display the next page, page 53. Use of neck restraints. Can you describe, in using those concepts of proportionality, when it's authorized to use a neck restraint of the two different varieties?
Yes, sir. On subjects who are actively aggressive, which means assaultive, they're actively resisting and other techniques haven't worked, you can use it then. And then on the bottom it says no, that you can't use it against subjects who are passively resistant.
And if you could go to the next slide, page 54. And after a neck restraint is applied, there are certain guidelines that you train that have to be followed. Is that right?
That's correct.
For the care of the individual upon whom the neck restraint was applied.
Yes, sir.
And if we could publish Exhibit 110 again, and bringing this specific topic back to the concept of proportionality, could you enlarge this, please? Do you have one of those stylus up there?
Oh, I guess I do.
You can touch the screen and make a mark here. Unconscious neck restraint. An unconscious neck restraint is when the person would actually be rendered unconscious, correct?
That's correct.
And intentionally so.
Yes, sir.
Could you please underline unconscious neck restraint as you see it in this response and control guide?
Yes, sir.
And what subject activity, what level of subject activity would be required to use an unconscious neck restraint?
Well, according to this chart, it's in the red area, so it would be active aggression.
Okay. And do you agree with that?
Yeah. I think in the last slide, we talked about active resistance if other techniques didn't work, but definitely in active aggression is where it's placed.
If we look then, you can also find a conscious neck restraint, and that's the neck restraint that's used for the purpose of control, correct?
Correct.
Could you underline where that is in this force continuum, Exhibit 110? And so the conscious neck restraint is authorized in circumstances where there's, in fact, active resistance. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So then if there was something like passive resistance, right, neither the conscious neck restraint nor the unconscious neck restraint would be authorized. Is that right?
Would not be authorized?
Would not be authorized.
That is correct.
And an unconscious neck restraint would not even be authorized for some forms of active resistance, would it?
That's correct.
And if the subject is offering no resistance, obviously, then no neck restraint would be authorized.
That's correct.
Or any restraint.
Or any,
Or any restraint, if there's no,
yeah, generally, no.
okay. In addition to the classroom training, you actually teach officers, show them physically how to do these sort of neck restraints?
Yes, sir.
At this time, I'd like to republish Exhibit 17. Sir, is this an MPD trained neck restraint?
No, sir.
Has it ever been?
Not to my, neck restraint? No, sir.
Is this a MPD authorized restraint technique?
Knee on the neck would be something that does happen in use of force that isn't unauthorized.
And under what circumstances would that be authorized? How long can you do that?
I don't know if there's a time frame. It would depend on the circumstance of the time,
Which would include what?
the type of resistance you're getting from the subject that you're putting the knee on.
And so if there was, say for example, the subject was under control and handcuffed, would this be authorized?
I would say no.
If you could take that down, please. Continuing in this defensive tactics presentation, if you could go back to Exhibit 119, page 56. You also teach officers the proper handcuffing and techniques, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And according to the handcuffing techniques, they're to be handcuffed behind the back, and the handcuff is to be double locked.
Sure. There's the jury. We're going to take our morning break. Let's reconvene at 11:15. Thank you. Lieutenant, you can step down for now.
Thank you, sir.